beneath layers of sand that have accumulated over countless centuries, beneath the weight of forgotten time itself, lie the ruins of a civilization that learned too late what happens when humanity reaches too greedily for power it cannot comprehend. Picture yourself descending through ancient stone corridors where the air itself seems heavy with warnings unheeded, where every grain of sand that crunches beneath your feet. Whispers of a catastrophe so complete that nature itself conspired to bury the evidence. The torches you carry flicker against walls carved with symbols that once held profound meaning, now reduced to cryptic remnants of a people who thought they had found salvation in blood, only to drown in the very essence of their own corrupted humanity. Welcome, lore seekers, to another deep dive with Keen 7 Lore, where today we unearth one of Bloodborne's most haunting cautionary tales, the complete and utter devastation of Loran, an advanced civilization that fell to the beast plague long before Yharnam's streets ran red with blood. What makes Loran's story particularly chilling isn't just the scale of its destruction or the horrific transformations its people endured, but rather how perfectly it mirrors the path Yharnam would later walk, as if history itself was desperately trying to warn humanity through the buried bones of an entire culture. The Loran we discover through Bloodborne's Chalice dungeons isn't merely another fallen kingdom added for atmospheric effect. These sand-choked ruins represent confirmed canon evidence of what the old blood truly costs when embraced without restraint. The ailing Loran Chalice itself tells us directly that perhaps due to excessive use of blood healing, the beast plague that stemmed from the old blood, and the beast which lurked within the frame of man laid waste to this entire city. More terrifying still, the Chalice's description makes the dreaded extrapolation that Yharnam may be next, transforming these ancient ruins from mere historical curiosity into an active prophecy of doom. As we navigate these buried hallways where sand pours through cracks in the ceiling, like hourglasses marking the end of days, we encounter beasts unlike anything stalking Yharnam's streets. These aren't simply larger or more aggressive versions of familiar enemies. They represent evolutionary paths of corruption that had centuries, perhaps millennia, to mature and mutate. The Loran Silverbeasts move with an unsettling intelligence, their bodies covered in fur that seems to shimmer with an almost metallic sheen, while the Darkbeasts crackle with electrical energy that defies any natural explanation. These creatures were once citizens of Loran, people who likely celebrated their civilization's discovery of blood healing as the dawn of a new golden age. If you're enjoying this exploration into Bloodborne's buried warning so far, I'd genuinely appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. It makes a real difference in helping this video reach fellow hunters and lore enthusiasts through YouTube's algorithm. Your support means everything and helps keep these in-depth investigations into gaming's darkest mysteries coming. The story of Loran begins not with plague or transformation, but with prosperity and advancement. Archaeological evidence scattered throughout the Chalice dungeons suggests Loran was once a thriving civilization that had achieved remarkable technological and cultural sophistication. The architecture we find, even in its ruined state, speaks to a society that understood complex engineering principles. Massive stone bridges span impossible chasms. Intricate mechanical elevators still function after untold ages, and the very layout of their cities demonstrates urban planning that rivals or exceeds what we see in Yharnam's upper cathedral ward. This wasn't some primitive culture stumbling upon power beyond their understanding. Loran's people were scholars, architects, and healers who believed they stood at the pinnacle of human achievement. The discovery of the old blood must have seemed like the natural next step in their evolution, a divine gift that validated their advanced status among the world's civilizations. We can imagine the excitement that must have rippled through their medical institutions when the first successful healing was performed, when wounds that should have been fatal closed before their eyes, when diseases that had plagued humanity since the dawn of time simply vanished from infected blood. The Loran Clerics, who would eventually become some of the most horrifying creatures in all of Bloodborne, likely began as the civilization's most respected religious leaders. These weren't mere priests conducting rituals they didn't understand. Evidence suggests they were scholar clerics who combined theological study with medical practice, not unlike the healing church ministers who would follow millennia later. They administered blood healing as both a medical treatment and a religious sacrament, viewing each miraculous recovery as proof of their divine mandate. If you're finding value in uncovering these buried truths about Loran's rise and fall, consider subscribing to join our growing community of lore investigators. Your support truly makes these deep archaeological expeditions into gaming's most complex narratives possible, and there's so much more darkness to unearth together. What makes the Loran Cleric's transformation particularly disturbing is how it differed from standard beast plague mutations. According to official enemy descriptions, these once human priests didn't simply grow fur and fangs like common church hunters who succumbed to bloodlust. Their faces became almost demonic, sporting thin, tendril-like tongues that dangle from permanently grinning mouths. More unnaturally still, they gained the ability to manipulate fire itself, breathing flames and hurling fireballs with an intelligence that suggests their human consciousness didn't entirely disappear, but rather merged with something far more sinister. The progression from healer to monster likely happened gradually enough that each step seemed reasonable, even necessary. Perhaps the first clerics to show signs of transformation were seen as blessed, their new abilities viewed as gifts that would allow them to better serve their people. We can imagine congregations gathering to witness these evolved clerics demonstrate their newfound powers, the faithful interpreting breathing fire as a divine ability granted to burn away disease and corruption. How long did it take, one wonders, before those same congregations realized the corruption they were meant to burn away existed within themselves? The common citizens of Loran faced their own unique evolutionary paths once the beast plague took hold. Unlike Yharnam, where most infected simply become various forms of beast men retaining largely humanoid shapes, Loran's plague produced dramatically different results. The Silverbeasts we encounter in the Chalice dungeons represent a form of transformation that seems to have incorporated the very environment into their being. Their metallic fur isn't merely an aesthetic difference. It provides them with resilience that surpasses anything seen in Yharnam's streets. These creatures move with a calculated intelligence, stalking through the ruins with purpose rather than mindless aggression. Archaeological evidence, particularly the remains found scattered throughout Loran's dungeons, tells a story of gradual societal collapse rather than sudden catastrophe. Layers of construction and destruction overlap, suggesting the city tried to adapt to its growing beast problem through architecture. Certain areas show evidence of reinforced barriers, trap mechanisms, and elevated walkways, infrastructure designed by a civilization trying to continue functioning even as its citizens transformed into monsters. The fact that such adaptations ultimately failed speaks to how completely the plague eventually consumed everything. The discovery of the bastard of Loran provides perhaps the most disturbing evidence of how thoroughly the beast plague infected every aspect of Loran society. This item, described as the remains of a Loran infant infected by the scourge, serves as both a catalyst for curses and a symbol of absolute defilement. The implications are staggering. The plague had become so endemic that even newborns emerged already infected, their humanity corrupted before they could take their first breath. The fact that these infant remains became items of power, used in rituals and as arcane catalysts, suggests that Loran's people eventually embraced their corruption so completely that they transformed their own cursed offspring into tools. Consider the psychological journey a civilization must undergo to reach such a point. Parents who once celebrated the birth of children now face the horror of delivering beasts. Midwives, trained to bring life into the world, became wardens of corruption. The very continuation of their species became an act of spreading the plague. Yet, rather than ceasing reproduction entirely, evidence suggests Loran's people continued having children, perhaps hoping each new generation might adapt to the corruption, or perhaps because they had simply accepted transformation as their new normal. The environmental catastrophe that eventually buried Loran beneath endless sand dunes represents another unique aspect of their downfall. While Yharnam's beast plague remains largely contained within the city's boundaries, affecting only the biological, Loran's corruption seemed to poison the very land itself. The phrase, devoured by sands, appears repeatedly in descriptions of Loran artifacts, but this wasn't merely a natural disaster or gradual desertification. The sand that fills Loran's ruins has an unnatural quality, pouring through solid stone as if the laws of physics themselves have been corrupted. Some scholars of the Old Blood theorize that this environmental destruction was actually a defensive mechanism triggered by the Great Ones. When a civilization becomes so thoroughly corrupted that its very existence threatens the cosmic order, perhaps the world itself responds by attempting to contain the infection. The sand that buried Loran might not be simple erosion, but rather a deliberate entombment, nature's way of quarantining a plague that threatened to spread beyond any conventional boundaries. The presence of dark beasts in Loran's ruins adds another layer of horror to their plague's progression. These creatures, crackling with electrical energy that courses through their corrupted bodies, represent an evolution of beasthood that Yharnam has only begun to glimpse through rare encounters like Darkbeast Pa'arl. In Loran, such beings appear to have been common enough to establish territories within the ruins. The electrical element of their transformation defies conventional understanding. How does biological corruption result in the generation of lightning? The answer might lie in the extended time frame of Loran's plague. While Yharnam's beast scourge has existed for perhaps a few generations at most, Loran's transformation occurred over centuries or longer. This extended exposure to the Old Blood's corruption allowed for evolutionary paths that shorter timescales simply cannot produce. The beasts of Loran had time to develop, mutate, and evolve into forms that incorporated elements seemingly impossible for organic beings. The electricity coursing through Darkbeasts might represent the Old Blood's corruption, reaching beyond mere flesh and into the fundamental forces that govern reality. The undead nature of many Loran beasts provides disturbing evidence that their plague transcended normal concepts of life and death. Creatures in the Chalice dungeons often display characteristics of beings that have died and been reanimated repeatedly. Their movements carry a weight of ages. Their bodies show damage that should be fatal, yet they continue to hunt, and their very presence seems to exist partially outside normal reality. This suggests that Loran's beast plague eventually corrupted the boundary between life and death itself, creating beings that could neither truly live nor properly die. We must also consider the timeline implied by these various stages of corruption. The transformation from human to beast, from beast to Silverbeast, from Silverbeast to Darkbeast, and finally to undead abominations represents potentially thousands of years of progressive mutation. Each stage likely took generations to manifest, meaning Loran's people watched their society's slow dissolution across multiple lifetimes. Children grew up knowing only a world where their grandparents were beasts, where the concept of pure humanity existed only in ancient texts, where each generation was more corrupted than the last. The role of blood ministration infrastructure in Loran's society deserves careful consideration. Unlike Yharnam, where the healing church centralized blood distribution through specific ministers and controlled locations, evidence suggests Loran developed a more democratized system. The presence of blood vials and healing implements throughout their ruins indicates that blood healing became as common as any other medical treatment. Every household likely had access to old blood. Every minor injury was treated with transfusion, and the line between medicine and corruption blurred until they became indistinguishable. This widespread adoption of blood healing might explain why Loran's plague achieved such complete saturation. In Yharnam, there remain pockets of resistance, people who reject blood ministration and maintain their humanity through isolation or adherence to foreign traditions. But in Loran, the integration was so complete that avoiding blood healing would have meant rejecting the very foundation of their society. Social pressure, medical necessity, and religious doctrine all pushed citizens toward regular consumption of the old blood, creating a population where every single individual carried the seeds of transformation within their veins. The discovery of Loran's ruins by later civilizations, particularly the scholars of Byrgenwerth and the tomb prospectors of the Healing Church, represents one of history's greatest ironies. These explorers descended into sand-choked dungeons, seeking knowledge and power, carefully documenting the warnings written in corrupted flesh and buried stone, yet somehow convinced themselves that they would be different. The Healing Church in particular seemed to study Loran's fate extensively, recovering chalices, ritual materials, and even preserved blood from the ruins, all while establishing their own blood ministration system that followed nearly identical patterns. The ailing Loran Chalice's warning that Yharnam may be next wasn't speculation, but rather observation of parallel development. Every stage of Loran's corruption has a mirror in Yharnam's progression. The initial celebration of blood healing, the establishment of religious institutions around ministration, the gradual appearance of beast plague, the transformation of clergy into unique abominations, and the slow acceptance of corruption as inevitable. The only significant difference is time frame. What took Loran centuries to achieve, Yharnam seems determined to accomplish in mere decades. Master Willem of Byrgenwerth likely understood this parallel all too well. His famous adage that humanity needs more eyes, not more blood, might have been directly inspired by studying Loran's fate. The scholars who first broke through into those ancient dungeons must have experienced a moment of terrible recognition, seeing in those sand-filled halls a preview of Yharnam's future. Yet even this knowledge couldn't prevent the schism that led to Lawrence founding the Healing Church, as if the allure of the old blood was strong enough to override even the most explicit warnings from history. The presence of Loran Silverbeasts in the Nightmare Realm provides a haunting connection between past and present corruption. These creatures don't simply exist in ancient ruins, but also manifest in the twisted realities created by the old blood's influence on consciousness itself. This suggests that Loran's corruption was so complete it imprinted itself on the fabric of reality, creating echoes that persist in nightmares and alternate dimensions long after the physical civilization crumbled. Every hunter who encounters these beings in the nightmare is essentially experiencing a memory of Loran's final days, preserved in the collective unconscious of the old blood itself. The technological prowess evident in Loran's architecture raises questions about what other knowledge was lost in their fall. The mechanical systems still functioning in their ruins demonstrate understanding of engineering principles that Yharnam has yet to rediscover. If such an advanced civilization could fall so completely to the beast plague, what hope does any society have of controlling the old blood's corruption? Perhaps advancement and sophistication actually make a civilization more vulnerable, providing the infrastructure and social organization necessary for corruption to spread efficiently through every level of society. We should also consider the possibility that Loran's people eventually embrace their transformation deliberately. The evidence of organized infrastructure adapting to beast presence, the ritualistic use of corrupted infants, and the development of unique evolutionary paths all suggest a society that at some point stopped fighting the plague and began directing it. Perhaps they believed they were ascending to a higher form of existence, that beasthood was not corruption, but evolution. The fire-breathing clerics might have been seen as angels, the Darkbeasts as gods of lightning, and the complete transformation of their species as a form of collective transcendence. This interpretation becomes even more chilling when we observe similar patterns in Yharnam. The healing church's upper echelons show signs of deliberately inducing transformation in specific ways, attempting to guide their evolution toward desired outcomes. The choir's experiments with cosmic contact, the school of Mensis's ritual to beckon the moon, and even the player hunter's potential transformations, all echo what might have been Loran's final philosophical position. If corruption is inevitable, why not try to control its direction? The sand that ultimately buried Loran carries its own symbolic weight beyond mere environmental disaster. Sand represents time, erosion, and the inevitable grinding down of all human achievement into constituent particles. Every grand monument, every breakthrough discovery, every moment of triumph Loran experienced, now exists only as sand-covered ruins that require archaeological excavation to even prove they existed. The civilizations that followed, including Yharnam, dig through these remains like grave robbers, pulling treasures and curses from the buried past without fully understanding that they're excavating their own future graves. The electrical evolution seen in Darkbeasts deserves deeper analysis, as it represents a form of corruption unique to extended exposure to the old blood. Electricity in biological systems typically exists at microscopic levels, governing nervous system function and cellular processes. The fact that Loran's beasts develop the ability to generate and channel lightning suggests the old blood's corruption can fundamentally alter the laws governing organic matter. These creatures don't simply use electricity as a tool, but seem to have incorporated it into their very being, their bodies becoming living conduits for forces that should destroy organic tissue instantly. This transformation might represent what happens when the beast plague has sufficient time to fully explore its mutagenic potential. Each generation of infected beings serves as an experimental platform for new forms of corruption, with successful mutations passing on to create even more dramatic variations. The electricity coursing through Darkbeasts could be the result of countless generations of progressive mutation, each slightly more capable of channeling energy until what emerged bore no resemblance to the humans who started the evolutionary chain. The presence of bone ash hunters in Loran's ruins tells another story of adaptation and survival. These beings, wrapped in funeral shrouds and wielding weapons of considerable sophistication, appear to be the remnants of Loran's last organized resistance against the plague. Unlike the transformed beasts, these hunters maintained some semblance of human form and purpose, though their exact nature remains shrouded in mystery. Were they humans who found ways to resist transformation? Undead warriors cursed to eternal vigilance? Or perhaps something else entirely? A fusion of human will and cosmic corruption that achieved a terrible equilibrium? Their continued presence after untold ages suggests that some fragment of Loran's civilization recognized what was happening and took desperate measures to combat it. The bone ash that gives them their name might have been a primitive form of the same techniques Gehrman would later perfect, using the remains of the corrupted to forge weapons against corruption. But where Yharnam's hunters operate for years or decades, Loran's bone ash hunters have persisted for millennia, their vigil extending long past any hope of saving their civilization. The ritual materials recovered from Loran provide disturbing insight into how their society functioned during the plague's height. The bastard of Loran, being used as a catalyst for curses, suggests that corruption became incorporated into their magical and religious practices. Rather than trying to purify or eliminate infected materials, they found ways to harness the power inherent in corruption itself. This practical approach to dealing with the plague might have extended their civilization's functional period, but ultimately accelerated their complete transformation by normalizing and institutionalizing corruption. Yellow backbone, a ritual material found throughout Loran, consists of the vertebrae of corrupted beasts that have achieved a certain level of transformation. The fact that these bones were harvested and used in organized rituals indicates that Loran's people developed systematic ways of categorizing and utilizing different stages of beast evolution. They created taxonomies of corruption, identifying which transformations produced useful materials and which resulted in mere mindless aggression. This scientific approach to studying their own doom parallels the Healing Church's later research, suggesting that the impulse to understand and categorize corruption might be a universal response to the beast plague. The Great One's relationship with Loran remains one of the most enigmatic aspects of their story. While Yharnam's interactions with cosmic beings are well documented through various encounters and communications, Loran's connections to these entities exist primarily through inference and archaeological evidence. The presence of cosmic arcane elements in their ruins, the unnatural nature of their environmental burial, and the persistence of their corruption in nightmare realms all suggest Great One involvement, but the exact nature of these interactions remains frustratingly vague. Perhaps the Great Ones viewed Loran as an experiment, allowing the civilization to pursue blood corruption to its ultimate conclusion, to observe the results. Or possibly Loran's people made contact with different Great Ones than those known to Yharnam, entities with their own agendas and methods. The electrical evolution of Darkbeasts might even represent a Great One's direct intervention, guiding the transformation toward outcomes that served cosmic purposes beyond human understanding. Without direct testimony from Loran's era, we can only speculate based on the horrifying evidence left behind. The architectural psychology of Loran's ruins reveals a civilization in gradual decline trying to maintain normalcy through increasingly desperate measures. Doorways were progressively reinforced and eventually sealed, suggesting families barricading themselves against transformed neighbors. Public spaces show evidence of hasty fortification. Markets turned into defensive positions, temples converted to quarantine zones. The normal functions of urban life were slowly subverted to serve the single purpose of survival against the beast plague, until the very structure of their cities reflected nothing but fear and desperation. Yet, even in this architectural evidence of societal collapse, we see attempts at maintaining civilization's trappings. Decorative elements continued to be added to buildings even as they were being fortified, suggesting that Loran's people clung to aesthetic and cultural values even as their world crumbled. These details, a carved relief added to a barricaded door, ornamental stonework on a defensive wall, speak to the human need to create beauty even in the face of absolute horror. They refused to let the beast plague reduce them entirely to animals, maintaining their humanity through art, even as their bodies betrayed them. The question of Loran's original discovery of the old blood remains frustratingly unanswered. Unlike Yharnam, where we know the blood came from the labyrinth beneath the city discovered by Byrgenwerth scholars, Loran's first contact with this corrupting force is lost to history. Did they unearth it from their own underground labyrinths? Was it gifted to them by great ones seeking worshippers? Or perhaps they developed it independently through their own investigations into the nature of life and healing. The origin matters because it might reveal whether the old blood naturally occurs throughout the world or whether all instances trace back to a single source. If multiple civilizations independently discovered the old blood, it suggests this corruption is a fundamental force in Bloodborne's universe, as natural and inevitable as gravity or time. Every society that advances far enough will eventually encounter it, and every encounter will end the same way, with transformation, corruption, and burial beneath the sands of forgetting. This interpretation transforms the old blood from a specific curse affecting certain locations into a cosmic constant that damns any species attempting to transcend their natural limitations. The preservation methods evident in Loran's ruins demonstrate remarkable foresight, or perhaps desperate hope. Certain chambers were sealed with such care that their contents remained intact for millennia. Ritual blood still flows in ceremonial vessels, weapons maintain their edge despite ages of disuse, and certain mechanisms function as if they were constructed yesterday. This preservation wasn't accidental but deliberate, as if Loran's final rational citizens knew their civilization was ending and chose to leave messages for whoever might follow. These preserved chambers often contain the most dangerous entities, suggesting that Loran's people understood that knowledge of the plague needed to be maintained alongside warnings about its consequences. They created time capsules that were simultaneously historical records and active threats, ensuring that future explorers would understand the beast plague not through abstract study, but through visceral encounter. Every hunter who faces a Loran Silverbeast or Darkbeast is receiving a direct message from the past. This is what we became. This is what awaits you. The linguistic remnants found in Loran's ruins, though largely untranslatable, show an evolution in how they described and understood the plague. Early inscriptions use terms that translate roughly to illness or affliction, suggesting they initially viewed the transformations through a medical lens. Later writings employ religious terminology, speaking of transcendence and communion. The final legible inscriptions abandon conventional language entirely, consisting of symbolic representations that seem to describe states of being that human language cannot adequately express. This linguistic evolution parallels what we observe in Yharnam, where medical terminology gradually gives way to religious ecstasy and eventually to incoherent ravings about eyes and cosmos. Language itself becomes corrupted by the old blood, as if human communication systems cannot contain the concepts necessary to describe what the plague truly represents. The failure of language might be one of the plague's most insidious effects, preventing infected populations from accurately warning others about what they're experiencing until it's too late. The gender dynamics of Loran's plague present intriguing questions about how the corruption affected different populations. The Bastard of Loran specifically mentions an infant, but we find little evidence of how the plague affected women, families, or social structures based on gender. Did pregnancy accelerate transformation? Did certain populations show resistance based on biological differences? The absence of clear evidence might itself be telling, suggesting that the plague eventually erased such distinctions entirely, reducing all of Loran's people to a single category: beast. This erasure of human social categories represents one of the plague's most fundamental horrors. all the complex social structures, hierarchies, relationships, and identities that define human civilization become irrelevant once transformation begins. A scholar and a laborer, a priest and a criminal, a parent and a child, all become beasts following the same evolutionary paths. The old blood doesn't discriminate or preserve human distinctions. It reduces everything to its most basic biological components and then corrupts those as well. The economic systems that must have supported Loran's blood ministration infrastructure would have been massive and complex. Producing, storing, and distributing old blood to an entire civilization requires organization on a scale that dwarfs Yharnam's healing church operations. There would have been blood farms, transportation networks, quality control systems, and distribution centers. The economic incentives to maintain and expand such systems would have been enormous, creating entire industries dependent on continued blood ministration, regardless of any negative consequences. We can imagine the political and economic forces that would have resisted any attempt to curtail blood healing once it became economically essential. Merchants who profited from blood trade, workers employed in ministration facilities, and politicians whose power derived from controlling blood distribution all would have had strong incentives to downplay or ignore early warning signs. By the time the beast plague became undeniable, the economic systems supporting it would have been so entrenched that dismantling them might have seemed as catastrophic as the plague itself. The role of children in Loran's final days presents perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of their story. The bastard of Loran confirms that infants were born infected, but what about older children? Did they transform more quickly or slowly than adults? Were there attempts to save the youngest generation through isolation or special treatment? The presence of small-sized equipment and furniture in some ruins suggests children continued to be part of society even as the plague spread, their parents desperately maintaining normalcy for their sake, even as the world collapsed around them. The psychological impact on children growing up during the plague's spread would have been profound. Imagine being raised in a world where your parents might transform into beasts at any moment, where playmates disappeared overnight, where the adults tasked with protecting you were slowly becoming the very monsters they warned you about. These children would have no memory of a world without the plague, no reference point for normal human existence. To them, transformation wasn't corruption, but simply the natural progression of aging. The artistic expressions found in Loran's ruins, paintings, sculptures, musical instruments, chart the civilization's psychological journey through the plague. Early artworks maintain traditional forms and subjects, depicting normal human life and celebrating their culture's achievements. As the plague progresses, the art becomes increasingly abstract and disturbing, with human forms distorted and beast imagery becoming prominent. The final artistic expressions abandon representation entirely, consisting of chaotic scratches and marks that seem less like deliberate creation and more like the desperate clawing of minds losing their grip on reality. Music, in particular, seems to have played a significant role in Loran's culture, with various chamber designs clearly intended for acoustic performance. The corruption of their musical traditions can be inferred from the twisted instruments found in the ruins, and the way certain beast howls seem to follow patterns that might once have been melodies. Perhaps music was one of the last human expressions to be abandoned, with infected citizens gathering to perform increasingly discordant compositions that reflected their transformation, until eventually all that remained were the howls and roars that echo through the ruins today. The medical practitioners of Loran faced an impossible situation as the plague progressed. Trained to heal using blood ministration, They found themselves spreading the very disease they were meant to cure. We can find evidence of medical facilities that were hastily converted from treatment centres to research laboratories, where desperate attempts were made to understand and reverse the transformations. Medical equipment lies abandoned mid-experiment, as if the researchers themselves transformed before completing their work, their final notes trailing off into incomprehensible scratches. The ethical dilemmas these medical practitioners faced must have been agonizing. Do you continue administering blood healing, knowing it contributes to transformation? Or do you let people die from curable injuries and diseases? Do you experiment on transformed citizens trying to find a cure, even though they were once human? Do you euthanize the infected before they fully transform? Or do you respect their autonomy even as they lose their humanity? These questions have no good answers, and the evidence suggests Loran's medical establishment eventually fractured under the weight of such impossible choices. The dietary changes necessitated by transformation provide another lens through which to view Loran's decline. Beasts require different sustenance than humans, and the infrastructure needed to feed a partially transformed population would have been nightmarish. Agricultural systems designed for human consumption would have become obsolete, replaced by what? The presence of blood vials suggests blood itself became a primary food source, but this creates a cannibalistic cycle where the infected feed on the uninfected, accelerating the plague's spread through predation as much as ministration. The breakdown of food systems might have been one of the practical factors that accelerated Loran's collapse. Even if some citizens resisted transformation, they would have faced starvation, as agricultural systems failed and transformed citizens competed for remaining resources. The choice between accepting blood, ministration, or starving to death isn't really a choice at all, forcing even the most resistant individuals to eventually accept corruption simply to survive another day. The transportation networks that connected Loran's various districts tell a story of gradual isolation and fragmentation. Major thoroughfares show evidence of barricades and checkpoints, suggesting attempts to control movement and contain infected populations. Eventually, these connections were severed entirely, leaving isolated pockets of survivors to face their fate alone. The elevators and bridges that still function in the ruins were likely the last maintained infrastructure, preserved by whoever remained rational enough to understand their importance until even they succumbed to the plague. This fragmentation would have accelerated the plague's psychological impact. Communities that might have supported each other through the crisis were cut off, leaving each group to develop their own explanations and responses to the transformation. Some districts might have embraced the change while others fought it. Some might have developed unique religious interpretations, while others clung to scientific rationality. The lack of communication between these groups meant that any successful strategies for resistance or adaptation couldn't be shared, condemning each pocket to rediscover the same failures independently. The seasonal cycles that once governed Loran's agricultural and social calendars became irrelevant as the plague progressed. Harvest festivals transformed into blood rituals. Seasonal celebrations became mourning ceremonies for the transformed. And the very concept of time, as measured by natural cycles, gave way to a new chronology measured in stages of infection. The sand that eventually buried the civilization might have been welcomed as a final season, an endless winter that at least provided the mercy of ending their corrupted existence. We find evidence of attempts to maintain timekeeping, even as traditional markers became meaningless. Mechanical clocks continued to be wound, calendars were updated, and records were maintained with a desperate precision that speaks to humanity's need for order even in chaos. These temporal anchors might have been the last threads connecting Loran's transformed citizens to their human past, maintaining the illusion that time still moved forward towards something other than deeper corruption. The role of dreams and nightmares in Loran's plague adds another layer of horror to their experience. The old blood doesn't just corrupt physical reality, but also invades the realm of consciousness and sleep. As more citizens transformed, the barrier between waking and sleeping, between reality and nightmare, would have progressively weakened. The Darkbeasts that generate electricity might have originated in nightmares before manifesting physically, dreams made flesh through the old blood's reality-warping properties. Consider the Bakhan, psychological torture of a population unable to escape the plague, even in sleep. Every dream becomes a preview of further transformation, every nightmare a prophecy of what they'll become. Parents would fear sleeping because their dreams might infect their children. Lovers would avoid sharing beds to prevent their nightmares from crossing over. The simple human comfort of peaceful sleep would become another casualty of the plague, leaving Loran's citizens trapped in perpetual waking horror or nightmare-infested unconsciousness. The preservation of certain human behaviors in transformed beasts suggests that consciousness doesn't entirely disappear during transformation. Silverbeasts still patrol territories that might have once been their homes. Darkbeasts gather in locations that could have been important to them in life. And even the most corrupted creatures show patterns that hint at human intelligence trapped within bestial forms. This persistence of human consciousness within transformed bodies might be the plague's cruelest aspect. The victims remain aware enough to understand what they've become, but powerless to resist their new instincts. This trapped consciousness might explain why certain areas of Loran show evidence of deliberate destruction from within. If transformed citizens retained enough awareness to recognize their own corruption, some might have tried to destroy themselves or prevent their own hunting behaviors. The claw marks on certain walls could be attempts at communication. The gathered corpses might be failed attempts at maintaining funeral rites, and the isolated beasts found in sealed chambers might have voluntarily imprisoned themselves while they still had the willpower to do so. The international response to Loran's plague, or rather the apparent lack thereof, raises troubling questions about how the outside world perceived their crisis. Did other civilizations attempt to help, only to be repelled by the infected? Did Loran deliberately isolate itself to prevent the plague's spread? Or did the outside world simply watch from a distance, studying Loran's fate while ensuring their own borders remained secure? The complete absence of foreign intervention in the archaeological record suggests that Loran faced their apocalypse entirely alone. This isolation might have been Loran's final gift to the world, containing the plague within their borders, even at the cost of their entire civilization. The sand that buried them could have been a self-imposed quarantine, a massive ritual designed to ensure that their corruption died with them. If true, this would represent an act of sacrifice on a civilizational scale, an entire culture choosing extinction over becoming the vector for global corruption. As we stand in the ruins of Loran, breathing air thick with ancient warnings and recent blood, the parallels to Yharnam become impossible to ignore. Every stage of Loran's journey from medical miracle to beast-infested wasteland is being replicated in the city above. The Healing Church studies Loran's ruins while following their exact path. Tomb prospectors retrieve artifacts of corruption to fuel further corruption, and hunters descend into these buried warnings only to emerge more committed to the very practices that created them. The tragedy isn't that Yharnam doesn't know about Loran, it's that they know perfectly well what happened and proceed anyway. The knowledge extracted from these ruins hasn't served as a warning, but rather as a roadmap, with the Healing Church seemingly determined to speedrun a catastrophe that took Loran centuries to achieve. Every blood vial consumed, every beast hunted, every citizen transformed represents another step down a path whose destination is literally buried beneath our feet. Perhaps the most profound realization is that we, as hunters exploring these ruins, are simultaneously archaeologists and prophecies. We document Loran's fate while actively participating in Yharnam's identical journey. Every piece of Loran's equipment we retrieve and use, every blood echo we consume from ancient beasts, every insight we gain from their corruption makes us living bridges between past and future catastrophe. We are both the ones who uncover the warning and the ones who guarantee it goes unheeded. The true horror of Loran isn't the beasts that still prowl its ruins or the sand that chokes its streets. It's the recognition that knowledge alone cannot prevent the cycle from repeating. Loran knew about the dangers of the old blood. Their medical texts and Rediscovery notes prove they understood the connection between blood ministration and transformation. Yet they continued anyway, driven by desperation, ambition, or perhaps simple momentum that made stopping seem impossible once the process had begun. As we emerge from these buried halls, covered in the dust of a dead civilization and the blood of its transformed citizens, we carry with us more than just ritual materials and blood echoes. We carry the weight of witnessing a complete civilizational life cycle, from prosperity through corruption to burial. We've seen what Yharnam will become, walked through previews of our own future ruins, and fought enemies that our descendants will one day resemble. The ailing Loran Chalice was right. Yharnam is next. Not because the cities are connected by curse or cosmic decree, but because they're connected by the fundamentally human inability to resist power, even when we know its price. Every civilization that discovers the old blood will walk this same path, and every civilization will convince itself that knowledge of previous failures will allow them to succeed where others fell. The sands that buried Loran are patient. They've waited millennia already, and they can wait a little longer for Yharnam to complete its transformation. Thank you for joining me on this archaeological descent into one of gaming's most profound cautionary tales. The ruins of Loran stand as monuments to humanity's eternal struggle between ambition and wisdom, between the desire for transcendence and the weight of consequence. If this exploration of buried truths and unheeded warnings has resonated with you, please consider subscribing to the channel and joining our community of lore seekers who refuse to let these stories remain buried. Your support makes these deep investigations possible, and there are so many more layers of history to excavate together. Remember that every civilization believes it will be different. Every generation thinks it has learned from the past's mistakes, and yet the ruins keep accumulating, layer upon layer, each one a warning to the next, and each one ignored in turn. Until next time, fellow hunters, may you find your worth in the waking world, and may you learn from the warnings that surround us, even when they're buried beneath millennia of sand and silence.